I'm going to answer questions for you tonight that you didn't even know you had. For instance, here's a good question for you about mummies. What did King Tut say when he was afraid? I want my mummy. Yeah, you see. Where do mummies go swimming? In the Dead Sea. Why are Egyptian children confused? Because their daddies were mummies. Yeah, those are pretty bad, aren't they? If you look on Google and you look under mummy jokes, there's hundreds of them. I picked out 3 of the best or worst. I'm not sure which it is. You know, mummies are kind of interesting, but there's a lot of jokes about them. And also there have been so many movies about mummies. It's surprising. One of the first movies, the first movie that I know of about mummies was in 1932. It was The Mummy with Boris Karloff, the Uncanny. And notice it says, it comes to life. The latest movie that I know of, there's actually been several recent movies. In late 1999, there was the movie The Mummy with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. And then there's a sequel to them. There's like 5 of those mummy movies at this point in time. During the 1940s, there was a whole group of movies on the mummies. They came out within 2 years. There was The Mummy, which was Boris Karloff, The Mummy's Hand, The Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Ghost, The Mummy's Curse. It's a wonder they didn't have The Mummy's Mummy, or something. I don't know. It seems like there have been so many popular, and one of my favorites was the 1955 Abbott and Costello movie, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, exactly. And I have chosen, Lou Costello has always been one of my heroes, and he met a mummy. And so much of what I've learned about mummies, I'm sharing with you tonight, I learned from Lou Costello. No, I'm just kidding. It's funny, though, how mummies have become so popular in joke and in movie. But aren't mummies really just a little bit mysterious? Only pyramids are perhaps more typically Egyptian than mummies. But when you think of mummies, you think of Egypt. And when you think of Egypt, you think of mummies. The word mummy brings to mind the wrapped bodies of long ago people who are somehow still mystically with us today. Aren't they just a little bit mysterious? After all, they are dead bodies. And the Egyptians developed a mummification practice that was the most elaborate of all in the world ever, especially though in ancient times. The word mummy comes from a Greek word, mumia, which means bitumen, or something preserved by bitumen. Now, bitumen is like asphalt. And so the word mummy comes from us through Greek to mean something preserved by bitumen. In modern usage, basically, it means the body of an animal or a human being that has been embalmed by some ancient Egyptian or by some similar means of preparation for burial. Now, usually when we think of mummies, we think of humans. But in actual fact, Egyptians mummified lots of animals too. And they're really quite fascinating. Here's a mummified bird, a mummified cat, a mummified dog, mummified fish from the Nile River, believe it or not, a baboon, a crocodile. Can you imagine that? That's a large mummified crocodile. And then they also mummified a lot of bulls because the bull was a sacred animal. And so it wasn't just humans, it was also animals. Now we usually think of mummies coming from Egypt, but in actual fact, mummies come from all around the world. Here's a natural mummy from a peat bog in Denmark. It's called Tolland Man. Unbelievable preservation of this guy's body. He was probably strangled to death. The noose is still around his neck. In Peru, because up in the top of the Andes, there's one of the driest and coolest deserts of the world. And so Peru has some of the most beautifully preserved mummies of the world. The one on the right looks like he perished in pain. There's a museum display right now in the city of Philadelphia at the Franklin Institute, Mummies of the World. It's only going to be there till like October 23. I'm hoping to make it there before it actually leaves Philly. But it actually has this next little bitty 10-month-old baby mummy. Just incredible preservation. Here in the United States, in the Southwest, some of the dry caves of the Southwest have preserved natural mummies. Melanesia in the South Seas is known for its mummies. In northern China, up in the Gobi Desert area, there were a number of fascinating mummies found about 20 or 30 years ago, and they don't look Chinese, and they don't know who they are. Fascinating natural mummies. In the museum exhibit in Philadelphia, they have this man from Hungary. He was found in a cellar in a very dry area, and his little girl, father and daughter. And then from Greenland, here's this, probably an Eskimo mummy, little baby. It's haunting. She's haunting. They're fascinating. She's from the 1400s. So you can see that they're from all around the world, and they're quite fascinating. And people have forever been fascinated by Egyptian mummies. In the 16th century, mummy was prized, but not because mummy was prized for the mummy, but mummy was prized as medicine. In the 1600s, and probably earlier than that, but we don't know exactly how early, in the 1600s, mummies became ground up and used for medicine. That's probably because the dark skin of the mummy resembled bitumen or asphalt, and there was a technique, or there was a treatment for certain ailments, cuts, bruises, fractures, nausea, and other ailments. Kind of sounds a little bit like snake oil, doesn't it? But there were all these ailments, and it was said that bitumen or asphalt cured them. And so because mummies looked a lot like that, they started grinding up mummies and using them for medicine. When asphalt became scarce, they started using the mummy. Now, there were some very important mummy merchandisers. One was a guy named John Helfrich. He was a German, came from Leipzig, who came, and he was so eager to buy some mummies that he just went out into the desert and began finding tombs and started digging. And he wasn't really very successful. Then came a man whose name was John Sanderson. He was an agent for the Turkey Company, and he spent 1585 to 1586 in Egypt. He lived in Alexandria. It talks about him going to the pyramids and visiting the Sphinx. And he was looking around for economic opportunities, and he heard about mummy as medicine. And so he spent much time at the Memphis mummy pits and began digging for mummies. And he collected 600 pounds of mummified flesh. Now, 600 pounds of human flesh wouldn't be that much. 5 people. But of mummified flesh, it was a lot. And so he found this mummified flesh, and it says also a whole body. And he planned to export them to England so they could be ground up and used for medicine. Now, it was not looked upon as being appropriate. And so Sanderson did what people have done for many years when they want to do something that's not appropriate. He bribed his way out of Egypt with his 600 pounds of mummy flesh. And the value of mummy flesh in Scotland in 1612 was 8 shillings per pound. So we are told that Sanderson made quite a tidy profit on his investment in 600 pounds of mummy flesh. It got to the point where it said that mummies became rare or came hard to come by. And so there was a French physician whose name was Guy de la Fontaine, who investigated the mummy trade about 1564 in Alexandria and discovered that because mummies were hard to find at that point in time, he discovered that people were going out and robbing modern graveyards and just finding bodies that were only a few years old but had become desiccated, and they were selling them for mummy flesh. It said that up until even into the 1800s, mummy flesh was used as medicine. It's said that King Francis I of France carried a small package of mummy with him as an emergency precaution. You know, what would be the emergency? Getting sick and needing the mummy flesh or eating the mummy flesh, you know. One has to think it couldn't have been that good for you. Sir Thomas Bourne, a philosopher, English philosopher, said this: mummy has become merchandise. Mizraim is an old term for Egypt. Mizraim cures wounds, and Pharaoh is sold for balsam. Even in the time of Mark Twain, mummy was remembered in kind of a humorous way. In his book, Innocents Abroad, Mark Twain writes this. He talks about riding on an Egyptian railroad. He says, the fuel they use for the locomotive is composed of mummies 3,000 years old, purchased by the ton or by the graveyard for that purpose. And sometimes one hears the profane engineer call out pettishly, darn these plebeians, they don't burn worth a cent. Pass out a king. Of course, I'm not really sure that happened, but it's funny. It's said that even in the 1970s, that it was possible to buy mummy flesh in the city of New York at certain shops, strange shops, certain alternative medicine shops. But first of all, let me ask the question when we talk about mummies, why was mummification so important? Mummification was important really as part of the religious belief. Now, when you think about what the Egyptians did to mummify and to bury their dead, you might get the idea that the Egyptians were preoccupied with death. And that's not true. The Egyptians were not preoccupied with death. The Egyptians were preoccupied with the next life. And so in death, it was necessary to make preparations in this world so that life in the next world would be perfect. So it would be paradise. And so all the preparations that were made and all the items that were put in the tomb were not for the death, but were for the life to come. Here's this fascinating ancient Egyptian poem, which is quoted in a book named Pharaohs and Mortals. It says this: death stands for me. Let's try this again. Death stands before me today, like health returning to the sick, like rising up from the sick bed. That's an interesting philosophy about death, isn't it? Did you pick it up? Death stands before me today, like health returning to the sick, like rising up from the sick bed. Death stands before me today like the scent of myrrh, like sitting beneath a sail with the wind blowing. Death stands before me today like the scent of lotus blossoms, like sitting on the shores of drunkenness. Death stands before me today like the departure of a storm, like the returning home from the wars. Death stands before me today like a clearing in the sky. Death stands before me today like the longing for home after many years as a captive. You see, death was not looked upon as being bad. It was not looked upon as something to be dreaded. It was looked upon as being the portal to the perfect life, to immortal life, to joy and the life to come. And so the Egyptians wanted to do everything they could possibly do to make it possible to make the transition into the afterlife. And so the purpose of mummification was to carefully preserve the body and the essential organs so that they could be guaranteed to function normally in the life to come. And so there was a very specific purpose for the mummification process. It would guarantee proper functioning of the organs. Now, the physical appearance, they wanted the physical appearance to be just as possible, or just as in death, just as like life as possible. And so that was one of the purposes for mummification. They believed that at death, the spiritual part of man, they called it the ba. The ba was the spiritual part of man. The ka was the body. The ba left the body, and it would fly around. It was represented as a bird, you see. It would fly around and leave the body for a certain period of time. And when the ba came back to the body, it was necessary for the ba to be able to recognize the ka, the body, in order to come back and live again in the body, which was essential for the afterlife. And so it was necessary for the body to look in death as close as possible to how it had looked in life, so that the ba could come back to it. If the ba could not recognize the body, then there would not be reunification, and the ba would wander lost for eternity. Now, it's pretty remarkable at some of the work they did. Here is an Egyptian pharaoh whose name was Seti the First. It's really a wonderfully well-preserved mummy. By the way, have any of you seen the mummies in the Egyptian Museum? Yeah. It's really fascinating to see. So this is Seti the First. Now, did they indeed accomplish their task? Well, here is a picture of Seti the First's mummy, and here is a wall carving of the face of Seti. You see, it looks reasonably good. And so I think they were reasonably successful at doing it. There were elaborate preparations necessary to make this happen. Now, the whole idea of mummification might have come from what we call pre-dynastic burials. These are really early burials, before 3100 BC. Basically, what they did was they took the bodies out, wrapped them up in mats, and put them into the hot, dry sand. And the dry sand and the heat went like this to the fluids of the body. And it dried the bodies out real quickly. And so they're remarkably, incredibly well preserved. That's probably where the idea came from. And you should understand that the climate of Egypt and the other places I just showed you a little while ago, Peru and the southwest United States, the climate probably has more to do with the quality of preservation of the body in mummies than the actual preparation of the bodies by the Egyptians. They didn't understand that. As a matter of fact, some of the things they did to preserve the bodies actually degraded the bodies worse than if they just left them alone. So here are these pre-dynastic burials. They're really quite fascinating. The dry sand would dry up the bodies, and they were remarkably well preserved. Now, the process of mummification changed over the years. We don't know exactly how they did it at any and every time period. And quite frankly, it was probably trial and error. They probably tried something to see how it worked, and if it didn't work, they tried something new. But remember, the goal is to preserve the body in death and make it as lifelike to life as possible. But we do know a lot about mummification because of a guy named Herodotus. It seems that mummification was somewhat a secret art. They never ever wrote on a papyrus the process of mummification. So we have no ancient papyri that tell us about, as a matter of fact, no ancient writing period that tell us how they mummified people. And so most archaeologists feel that it was probably kind of a secret art practiced by a secretive group of men. And it was never written down. But Herodotus, I've told you a little bit about Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek historian, tourist, who was traveling in all around the world, actually, in the ancient world, in about 400 BC. He went to Egypt, and he says that he witnessed mummification. And he tells us that in Egypt, at this point in time, we're talking about 400 BC, there were a group of men, he says, whose job it was to embalm dead bodies. Of course, you wouldn't embalm live bodies, would you? So they were the embalmers. And when they went in, Herodotus tells us that when they went in, the families were shown a model of what their loved one could look like. Now, we don't have any of those models available to us, but the Egyptians, I put this picture in here because it shows you how the Egyptians made these beautiful models. They carved them and painted them. So Herodotus tells us that the families were taken in and showed wooden models to choose what they would like their loved one to look like. They were shown 3 styles. Perfect, like Osiris himself. Osiris was the god of the underworld. They were shown one that was kind of a middle quality, and then shown one of a basic quality. Kind of sounds a little bit like today, doesn't it? And what was the determining factor? You guessed it. How much do you want to spend? How much do you want to spend? He goes on to describe how the process was really accomplished. And so I want to give you a description of what he says happened in the process of mummification. There were 13 steps. The first step was that after the person died, they were just taken to the mortuary temple, or where the embalmers worked on the dead bodies. By the way, I gave this lecture, the first time I ever gave this lecture was in the city of Philadelphia, at my church in Philadelphia, and one of my church members was a funeral director. His name was Alvin Wetzel. And after I gave this lecture, Alvin he was an older man then, probably in his 70s, so he had been involved in the funeral business for many years, and he came up to me and told me that the Egyptians knew what they were doing, because he understood after I went through this process he understood that the Egyptians knew what they were doing to have to try to preserve the body in the best way they could. And so the first step was to take the dead Egyptian man or woman to the embalmers. And because Anubis, that's the god there you see with the jackal head on it, because he was involved in the underworld, there is some evidence that probably many of the embalmers actually wore masks to make them look like Anubis. It's quite fascinating. They were placed on a mummification table, and archaeologists have found what we believe to be embalming tables. And you can see one here. This is in the Cairo Museum. You see it's kind of dish-shaped just a little bit. That would be for collecting body fluids. And then also there's a place where the head could be tilted back in this table. And you'll see why that was important in just a moment. The second step was the removal of the brain. It's interesting that there's only one part of the body that the ancient Egyptians threw away in mummification, and that was the brain. They did not know what the brain was for. I know there are a lot of people who are like that today, too. My wife's a teacher. She can give you names of students who don't know what their brains are for, but she won't. But they did not know what the brain was for, and so they quickly tried to get it away from the body. And there's another issue with the brain. The brain is heavily with moisture, lots of water in the brain cavity. And so what they did was they went through the nose. The thinnest bone in our skull is inside the nasal cavities. And so they would break through the nasal cavities with a hook. And it was always said in the past that they would pull the brain out through the nasal cavities with this hook. And archaeologists have actually found hooks that seem as though they were used for this purpose. Now, a guy named Bob Breyer, who is a modern Egyptologist, a number of years ago performed an actual mummification on a body, on a modern human, using the ancient Egyptian methods. It was actually very controversial, and they still maintain the body today. They're still studying the body today. And Bob Breyer mummified this body according to the ancient methods. And they fashioned hooks and knives and stuff like the ancient people would have used. He discovered that the brain would not come out on this hook. This is kind of gross, forgive me, but push the hook in there, and the brain material would not hook onto the hook and be pulled out. And so Bob Breyer suggested that what happened actually was they used the hook as a scrambled egg scrambler and liquefied the brains, which is why the mummification table had the little place where the head could be lower than the rest of the body. And so Bob Breyer suggests that it was not pulled out, but it was actually allowed to drain out. Exactly. The second part was taking out the brain. Sorry, just telling you the way it was. The third part was the extraction of the viscera. In other words, the internal organs. An incision was made in the abdomen, usually on the left-hand side, but not always. There are ways it was usually done, but not always. It was an incision made with a sharp knife, depending on what the time it was. Sometimes it was a sharp flint knife, but they also have found in ancient tombs, they've found bronze and copper knives, and so perhaps those were made for this purpose. It wasn't a large incision, but a small incision was made, and it seems as though the embalmers weren't trying to lay open the whole abdominal cavity, but it was just a small incision, and then they used their hands to reach up and pull out the viscera. I know I'm being graphic, but that's just the way it was. The heart was almost always left in place. Why? Because the heart was the seat of emotion. The heart was the seat of thinking. Why did they believe that? Well, haven't you ever felt heartsick when you were sad? Or if you get scared, your heart starts beating quickly? And so the ancient people believed that the heart was the center of knowledge. And so almost always they left the heart in place. The fourth step was sterilization of the body cavity. They probably poured some kind of wine into the body cavity, which would probably cut down on some of the smell at this point in time. But it would also sterilize the body cavity, trying to get rid of as many germs, although they didn't understand germs, but they understood that it seemed like it helped. And so sterilization of the body cavity and the viscera. At this point in time, the fifth step was the taking of the viscera, that is the liver, the stomach, the lungs, and the intestines, and they were mummified separately. And when they were mummified separately, they were taken and put into what are called canopic jars. This is the head of a canopic jar that I have in my collection out front. You can see it out there. The canopic jars were typically had heads on them, had lids on them that were patterned after the four sons of Horus. And this happens to be one of his sons, Kabessenuf. And so the viscera were mummified separately, and you can see here this canopic jar has the head of a man. There's one with the head of the jackal god, that's also Kabessenuf. They came in various styles, oftentimes jars, but here's this marvelous looking mini coffin that was a canopic jar for someone. And then the most beautiful from the tomb of King Tut. This was the head of the canopic jar. And all four of his canopic jars had the head of King Tut on them. Just beautiful, beautiful alabaster carving. Just lovely. After the liver, the stomach, the lungs, and the intestines were properly mummified and put in their canopic jars, the next step on the main body was to stuff the body full of temporary wrapping, put in something I'm going to tell you about more in just a second called natron, and put in bandages and stuff, and it was sewn together. Now, one of the purposes of this step was so that as the body dried, the body wouldn't shrink. And so if they stuffed the abdominal cavity full, then the body, as it dried, the abdomen would dry like this, not like that. So it seems to have been an important step. The seventh step was probably the main thing that had to be done. It was the dehydration of the body with salts. Now, it's interesting that in the Bible, this custom is reflected because, you know, the Jewish people spent some time down in Egypt. Joseph. Here's Genesis 52:3. It says, "Then Joseph delivered to the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel." That's Jacob. "So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days." So there were 40 days, and it seems to be that the 40 days were the time for the dehydration of the body. And so the body was placed in natron. Now, natron is a naturally occurring salt in Egypt. As a matter of fact, there's a lake called Lake Natron, and it has very little water in it and lots of salt. But it's collected there over the years. And so it seems as though they went down to Lake Natron and gathered huge quantities of this salt and brought them back up to use for mummification. Something I have not been able to chase down yet as to whether or not the natron was able to be used over and over again, or whether if it was just used a couple times, than if it became ineffective? I haven't been able to chase that question down yet, and perhaps we really don't even know. But the bodies were placed in some kind of large container, and the bodies were totally covered with natron. And the natron caused the drying out of the body, the salt. I've seen this in another way in modern times. Some of you might have really a lot of allergy to poison ivy. And my wife, when she gets poison ivy, what she does is she gets salt and puts a little water on it and rubs the poison ivy with salt. And it seems to dry the poison ivy out. It seems to be a very, very effective treatment for poison ivy. And you can see how then this would work in the time of mummification. After the 40 days of the drying out process, the 8th step was the removal of the packing material. And at this point in time, the 9th step was the packing of the body with permanent stuffing. Now notice on this little boy mummy, or maybe it's a little girl, it's hard to tell. You see how the eyes aren't all sunken in? It's because they were stuffed with bandages. Or I've seen, very interesting, a couple mummies that the eyes were actually stuffed with onions. That's how the eyes were kept from caving in. They were also, body cavities were stuffed with linen cloth, bags of other materials like natron, sawdust, earth, and as I say, a few onions every once in a while. The incision was closed over. It's interesting, at this point in time, for the final preparation of the body, the incision was not sewn shut, but in most mummies it was covered with a piece of metal, a piece of bronze, copper. Of course, if you were a royal mummy like Tutankhamun, his incision was covered with gold. Wouldn't surprise you. The body was anointed with fragrant materials. The orifices, the tenth one was the orifices were packed. All the face orifices were packed. So the mouth was packed full of something. The eyes were packed full of something. And it's interesting that this is the mummy of Ramses III. And Ramses III actually was the mummy that was the model for that 1932 Boris Karloff movie that I showed you a little while ago. This was their model for Boris Karloff in that movie. The 12th was that they smeared the body with molten resin. Now, resin was like the sap of trees, or if they could find bitumen, the asphalt, they would use that. And this pouring on and sealing of the body with the resin was really what gave the mummies their distinctive brown color. The 13th step was the putting on of amulets all around the body as they are getting ready to wrap it, or as they are wrapping it. Now, amulets were very important because amulets were in essence good luck charms. And so certain gods and goddesses were responsible for protecting certain parts of the body. And so when they put the wrappings on, they would put these amulets guarding certain parts of the body. And you can see in a new frame I put out in the lobby there, you can actually see a number of really pretty little amulets that they would have used in bandaging the bodies. Here are 3 of the amulets that are the most powerful of amulets. These are called the Eye of Horus. This is Duamutef, amulet of the god Duamutef. On a royal mummy, there would be dozens of amulets protecting the body. And these are all placed in the body as the body is being wrapped. Now, wrapping the body was a fascinating thing. It was wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen cloth. You can see this is a mummy that was uncovered. During the late 1800s, it was an interesting thing. Rich people would buy mummies, bring them to their homes in Britain, and then they would have a party, an unwrapping the mummy party. I kind of think it'd be fun. What refreshments would you serve at an unwrapping the mummy party? I don't know. But you can see how, look at this picture, you can see how much linen was used in wrapping this mummy. Each finger was individually wrapped, and then the hand would be individually wrapped. Each toe individually wrapped, and then the whole foot. Very painstakingly put together. It was in this wrapping process that often they would include a mask. And of course the purpose of the mask was to make it look as much like the dead person as possible. So if the mummy didn't attract the back, the mask would, you see. And so you can see in my collection out here 3 of these, they're called caw masks, trying to help the ba find his way back home. This is a fascinating thing we found on a ancient Egyptian papyrus talking about the end of the process. Okay, folks, that's a wrap. After they were finished with the wrapping of the mummies, they were placed in oftentimes very elaborate burial coffins. Oftentimes they were nested. You can see here these 3 nesting coffins. Here's one of the inner coffins of Tutankhamun. They put the inner coffins into larger coffins. And then here's a picture showing the steps. You see on the right-hand side the mummy, and then a coffin, then a larger coffin, and then the outer coffin. Very, very common way for them to be buried. And in the tomb, there was the purpose. And one night on the lecture entitled "The Journey King Tut Missed," I'll tell you about all kinds of objects and why they were placed in the tomb. But the purpose was to put in the tomb everything that a person would need in the next life. And of course, one of my favorites is Ushabtis. And Ushabti is a servant of the dead. Now some of you wish you had an Ushabti at home, because the purpose of the Ushabti was that in the afterlife, when a person is called upon to do work, the Ushabti says, "I'll do it." Don't you wish you had a few of these around your house? Somebody needs to wash the windows. "I'll do it." Yeah. These are such wonderfully Egyptian objects, and there are several out in the display that you probably have already seen. I particularly love the blue color of this one. I'll tell you more about Ushabtis the night we talk about King Tut. Everything that the person needed in the afterlife, it was there. So that's the purpose of mummies. Now, how do we know what we know about mummies? Well, there's this interesting study of ancient mummies. It's actually the study of disease of men and animals from ancient sources, like mummies. There's this study of ancient diseases. It's called paleopathology. You know what pathology is? A study of why people die and stuff like that. This is paleopathology. Modern detectives looking at ancient evidence. And so mummies are looked at by paleopathologists. These paleopathologists have performed a tremendous feat in their understanding. They have discovered what was killing ancient Egyptians. Here's an interesting text from the Bible. It says this, Exodus 15:26. God says, "If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what was right in his eyes," what is right in his eyes, "if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. God is making a promise here. He's saying to the Israelites that if you pay attention and live the kind of life I tell you to live, you do what is right, what I've told you is right. If you do that, I will keep the diseases that the ancient Egyptians are dying from, I'll keep them from coming on you. Now, is this a supernatural protection or is it cause and effect? And I think it's both. And I'll show you why as we look at ancient Egyptian mummies. What killed the ancient Egyptians? In the Bible and to the Israelite people, God gave very specific instructions as to how he wanted them to live. And he says, if you will live as I've asked you to live, you'll be protected from the diseases that I have brought upon the Egyptians. This may be a new idea to some of you, that God cares about how we live our lives in a physical way. But God cares about how we live our lives in a physical way because of what we call the holistic view of mankind. Our physical health affects our mental health and our spiritual health. Our mental health affects our physical health and spiritual health. And our spiritual health affects our physical health and our mental health. You see, we have the physical part, the mental part, the social part, the spiritual part. They're all part of man. And they're all interconnected. Now, you know that's true, don't you? You get up in the morning and you got the flu. You can't quit hugging the toilet bowl. Someone comes in and tries to talk to you. Go away. I don't want to be bothered. Well, your physical health has just affected your social health, right? You're sick home with a bad cold. You try the practice of reading a little bit of the Bible every day, and you get this bad cold and you just feel miserable. It's like, I know I should have my Bible study today, but I just don't feel like it. You're depressed. Your mental health is bad. You lose weight. Or in some cases, you gain weight. It depends on what kind of depression, how you deal with your depression. But you see what I'm saying? Our mental, our spiritual, and our physical are all interconnected. And so because God is concerned about our spiritual health, he's also concerned about our mental health and our physical health. And so he says, if you're going to pay attention to me, I'm giving you some instructions here. If you pay attention to me, I will keep the diseases of the Egyptians from coming upon you. So what were the Egyptians dying of? Well, that's what the paleopathologists are able to tell us about. God says, I won't bring the diseases of the ancient Egyptians upon you. So God gave in what's called today the Mosaic Health Code, he gave in the Mosaic Health Code principles to help us avoid the diseases of the Egyptians. Paleopathologists have studied lots and lots of ancient mummies. They've done ancient mummy autopsies. Especially, this was back in the 70s, there was a doctor named Rosalie David in Manchester, England, who did many autopsies of mummies and did them very carefully, because you understand, once you autopsy a mummy, basically you've destroyed the evidence. And so she was a very meticulous detective. There was another man whose name was James Harris, who worked with an Egyptologist whose name is Kent Woods, and they went around and x-rayed hundreds of mummies, trying to understand what the ancient Egyptians were dying from. So here is the head of a man named Thutmose I, Pharaoh of Egypt. And they x-rayed his body. Here's the x-ray of Thutmose I. One of the most fascinating things they're doing these days is CAT scans. And so here is an important officer of, used to be, head of the Antiquities Department in Egypt. He's no longer there when Mubarak lost his position. Zahi Hawass stayed on for a while, but finally he was thrown out of office too. They've done lots of CAT scanning of ancient mummies, and it's fascinating. They've developed a method of using the CAT scan information to make models of skulls, and then paleopathologists and people who do facial reconstruction can actually suggest what ancient Egyptians looked like by reconstructing their faces. You've probably seen them do that with people who are missing. They can do this with evidence from ancient mummies. Archaeologists have found that in the earliest dynasties, ancient Egyptians were living relatively healthy lives. Now, they had hard lives, but they lived largely, they had a diet that was largely vegetarian, and they worked hard, they were physically fit, and they had remarkably good health. Here's an Egyptian pharaoh, a very early dynasty named Nefer. Nefer had no tooth decay, no arthritis. Now, admittedly, the life expectancy of one of these ancient Egyptians at an early dynasty was probably about 40 years. But they worked hard. They worked very, very hard. But no tooth decay and no arthritis. This is a very early dynasty. Now, when we get into the later dynasties, the 18th through the 21st dynasties, and this is the general time period. I put Moses' time in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, about 1450 BC, I put Moses. So in the later dynasties, there's a change of lifestyle and a change of diet amongst the wealthy. And it's at this time when God says, I won't put the diseases of the Egyptians upon you. I will protect you from them. What's happening? They studied these later dynasty wealthy people, not the common people, but the wealthy people, and they began to see differences in their lifestyle. There was a higher meat diet, there was no exercise, and there was more refined sugars and grains in their diets. Here's a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep III. This is Amenhotep I. He's from the 18th dynasty, which makes him basically the time of Moses. His mummy case is just beautiful. And they've done this interesting x-ray of his mummy case. This mummy has never been unwrapped, and so what we know about it from the x-rays. When they have looked at the x-rays of Amenhotep I, they discovered that he had arthritis and he had diabetes. Here's the guy we just saw a second ago, Seti I. He was the first ruler of the 19th dynasty. X-rays reveal that he had cavities, he had missing teeth, he had arthritis, and other health problems. Here is Ramses II. Ramses II is the pharaoh of Egypt who reigned the longest of any other pharaoh of any dynasty in Egypt. He probably reigned over Egypt about 60 years. He died well over 70. Some of you might have seen this picture of Abu Simbel. This is Abu Simbel in the very, very southern part of Egypt. Abu Simbel bears the image of Ramses II. As a matter of fact, Ramses was such a great builder that about half the monuments of Egypt today bear the name Ramses II. He's an interesting guy because what he didn't build, he stole. I think this is really a humorous thing. He'd go to a place where another pharaoh had built a temple, and he'd chisel out their name and put his name in. I've often wondered if the Egyptian gods up in heaven looked down one day and said, I didn't remember Ramses built that temple. I thought Amenhotep built it. I guess Ramses did. His name's on it. Very powerful ruler. The longest of all. We call him Ramses the Great. There's only one. There's 12 Ramses, but only one Ramses the Great. Well, when they examined Ramses' body, they discovered that he had cavities, arthritis, arteriosclerosis. By the time this guy died, he was probably very senile. Very senile. Because in the ancient Egyptian world, 70 was very old. Very old. Here's another king, 19th dynasty king. His name is Merneptah. Even though his mummy looks pretty svelte, he was actually very, very obese. There's one later pharaoh, by the way. He's a Ptolemaic pharaoh, so he's about 900 BC. He was so obese they called him Fatty. I don't think that would be a good idea. But Merneptah was very, very obese. When they examined his body, he was missing his back teeth. He had periodontal disease. He had cavities. He had a broken hip. He had degenerative arthritis and arteriosclerosis. And these are actual pictures that they did many, many years ago, the cross sections of his arteries, and he had artery plaque that suggests also again that he probably was senile by the time he died. Here's Yuya and Tuya, husband and wife, grandparents of Tutankhamun. They were both discovered in their tomb in the Valley of the Kings. They both had severe arthritis and dental disease and cirrhosis of the liver. Now, these people were living the high life. One of the most recent mummies to have been identified is a queen named Hatshepsut. And I have a special interest in Hatshepsut because if you were here the opening night, you might remember that I said I believe Hatshepsut to be the queen of the stepmother of Moses at the time of the Exodus. We've never known which mummy was hers, and so archaeologists in Egypt have been seeking to find out which mummy of a group of mummies, royal women mummies, was indeed Hatshepsut. They had found in Tutankhamun's tomb a little box with a tooth in it that said it was from Hatshepsut. And so recently they began looking at all the female mummies they had. Royal mummies were always buried with their hands crossed against the chest. Mortal mummies were buried with their hands to their side. And so they had these female mummies that had their hands across the chest. And as they looked at these mummies, they discovered one that had a missing tooth. They took the tooth from Tutankhamun's tomb and it fit. And so they've now discovered which is Hatshepsut's mummy. Hatshepsut was a very interesting woman, because she was a woman pharaoh. And the only one. This is actually a statue of Hatshepsut. Now you might think that Hatshepsut's health problems was hormonal, but she didn't really grow that beard. You understand that's a fake beard. They've examined Hatshepsut's body, and they have discovered that Hatshepsut had arthritis, diabetes, bad teeth, and Hatshepsut died from bone cancer. They don't find a lot of cancer amongst the ancient Egyptians. None amongst the working classes. But Hatshepsut probably died of cancer. What's going on here? What's going on here is that the upper class of people in the 18th through the 21st dynasties were living the high life. The kings, the priests, the officials, the nobles, the landowners. They imposed upon themselves no restrictions in regard to food, drink, and other pleasures. And so what happened? They were killing themselves from lifestyle diseases. The same kind of lifestyle diseases that Americans are dying from today. Whereas the poor working class people were, well, here's the list of the ones that the Egyptians were dying from, the wealthy ones: atherosclerosis, heart disease, obesity, cancer, tooth decay, venereal disease, diabetes, arthritis, and a host of other problems. This is what was killing those ancient Egyptians. Whereas the lower classes, the working class people, were dying of other diseases. I just read a fascinating article. I just got off the internet, and it said amongst the working class people, they'd found no cancer whatsoever, diabetes, no, heart disease, no. What was killing the working class Egyptians? Parasitic diseases. They still in Egypt today have something called schistosomiasis, which is a parasite in the Nile River. When I was in Egypt, I had to put my feet in the Nile River because my wife says if you don't put your feet in the water, you weren't really there. And so I was just happy I didn't come home with parasites. The ancient poor working class people were dying of lung diseases from the smoke of the fires and the dust from working in the tombs. Venomous snakes were a real hazard. And teasingly, they also point out the fact that occasionally some of these poor working class people were stampeded by hippos and killed by crocodiles. That's what was killing the poor working class. But the wealthy people were dying from those other diseases. And most of the diseases that you saw are not from work-related ideas or work-related activities, but they're lifestyle diseases. So what did God tell the Israelites that could have protected them from these diseases? Well, here's a passage in Leviticus 3:17. It says this: "This is a lasting ordinance from generations for the generations to come. Wherever you live, you must not eat fat or any blood." Fat. How much do doctors talk today about fat intake? Fat grams. A lot. And here God, 3,500 years ago, told the Israelites that they should be concerned about their intake of fat. Fat leads, especially animal fat, leads to heart disease. Here's another text in Leviticus 11. Leviticus 11 has all kinds of information about clean and unclean meats. In Leviticus 11, 2 and 3, it says this: "Say to the Israelites, of all the animals that live on land, these are the ones you may eat. You may eat any animal that has a split hoof, completely divided, and that chews the cud." Now, are any of you farmers, you understand what chewing a cud means? It means the animal has more than one stomach and eats it and then burps it up and chews it again for a while. And that's kind of gross, but that's the way it is. God says the clean animals are the ones that have a split hoof and chew the cud. That makes cows clean to eat. That makes sheep, goats, deer. That makes swine unclean. That makes horses, although most of you would not eat horse meat, that makes horses unclean. Now, why is God saying this? Because God could see that these animals would not bring so much fat into the diet. One of the first things, my mother tells me this story from many years ago. She couldn't quite believe all this stuff from Leviticus about God saying you shouldn't eat pork. And my uncle got very, very sick with heart disease, and they went to the doctor, and one of the first things the doctor said to him is, "No more pork." And she began listening, because that's what the Bible said. There's also another passage here for seafood. "Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales." What animals or what seafood has fins and scales? Primarily, they're swimming fish. They're not bottom-dwelling fish. They're swimming fish. The distinction is that these guys are up in the clean water, at least it used to be, swimming around, and they're not on the bottom. What's on the bottom? What's on the bottom of the ocean, upon ponds and the rivers? What's on the bottom is everything that's decayed up here and gone down. All the impurities that have come down are on the bottom. As we used to like to tease my children, the fish go potty up here, and all of it goes down here. The lobsters, the crabs, the oysters, the flounders, all those bottom-dwelling animals. God says they're not clean. Absolutely, they're not clean. Look what they're living in. They're not clean. God says we shouldn't eat them, and if we don't eat them, He'll keep the diseases from the Egyptians from coming upon us. He continues on in Leviticus 11, 13 through 19. It says, these are the birds that you are to detest and not eat because they are detestable. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the red kite. It continues on there. It gives you all kinds of animals, all kinds of birds that are unclean. And then it basically says, if they aren't these, then they are clean. God's very specific as to what is clean and what is unclean. Now, some people say, that's not really that important. Those are all Jewish dietary laws. God gave those laws to the Jews. But in actual fact, these laws of clean and unclean meat were not given to the Jews at Mount Sinai, but they go all the way back to the flood. In Genesis 7:2, when Noah takes in animals into the ark, God says this: take with you 7 of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and take 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate. So already at the time of the flood, God had decided what animals were clean and what animals were unclean. Why did it take 7 of the clean animals in? Because they're going to eat them. Why do they take only 2 of the unclean animals? They're not going to eat them. Had they eaten them, it's called extinction, you see. And so very, very early, even back to the time of the flood, God had decided what was clean and unclean for us to eat. And a marvelous thing is true. Do you know that human stomachs 6,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago processed food just like they do today? Human arteries got clogged up thousands of years ago just like they do today. And so what God said was proper to eat back then is still proper for us to eat today. And so God has given these laws in Scripture. Why? So that we don't get the diseases of the Egyptians, the diabetes, the atherosclerosis, the heart disease. All these things. God was trying to protect us with this information. Now, it may be a new idea to you that God really cares about our physical health and that it's a spiritual issue. But that's what he says. Listen to this text in 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20. It says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You are bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. God wants us to honor him with our health. Why does he care about our health? Because he has no one on this earth to do anything for him except for us. And if we're sick, we can't serve him. So God wants us to have the best health possible. Here's this text in 3 John verse 2. It says, dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well. You see that interesting parallel? I want you to have good health, and I want you to also have good spiritual health. And John is writing to his friends, and he sees that both of them are important because they affect one another in our whole life. God wants us to be the very best we can possibly be. I want to just tell you for a second, I told you this lecture was going to be hard to get through in an hour, so we're almost there. I want to tell you just a little bit about what Seventh-day Adventists have learned about some of these laws of unclean meats and stuff. And you might think this is commercial. That's okay, because there's something about this lifestyle that I want to share with you. Seventh-day Adventists believe, as a point of spiritual life, that we should obey clean and unclean meats. Seventh-day Adventists are not alcoholic beverage drinkers. Seventh-day Adventists are not smokers. I can't tell you that no Seventh-day Adventist ever smokes, but it's part of our belief. Adventists are careful in the use of drugs, even over-the-counter medication. Adventists try to limit the intake of too much refined foods and sugars. Seventh-day Adventists try to be caffeine-free for the most part. Many Adventists limit the use of animal products like cheese, eggs, and milk. Seventh-day Adventists have known about the benefits of exercise for 100 years. Here's this fascinating quotation written by a woman named Ellen White 106 years ago. She says this: "Here is a suggestion for all those whose work is sedentary or chiefly mental." That's me. "Let those who would have sufficient moral courage and self-control try it. At each meal, take only 2 or 3 kinds of simple food and eat no more than is required to satisfy hunger. Take active exercise every day and see if you do not receive benefit." 100 years ago, Seventh-day Adventists already understood the importance of our diets and of exercise. And then the last thing on the list here is that the Seventh-day Adventists believe in the observance of Sabbath as a day dedicated to God without the task of work or making a living, a spiritual day. This is a lifestyle that we, as Seventh-day Adventists, not all of us live every single point perfectly, but it's a lifestyle that we espouse. And what's the payoff? We have a large university in Loma Linda, California, who's done some interesting studies about the Seventh-day Adventist lifestyle. Long-term studies. As a matter of fact, they're in the middle of a new one right now. And they have discovered that Seventh-day Adventists live 7 years longer than the general population because of all those lifestyle things that I just shared with you. Seventh-day Adventists tend to live 7 years longer. Some of them have gone a step further. Genesis 1:29 says, "Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. These shall be yours for food." I believe God's original plan in the Garden of Eden, when he gave it to Adam and Eve, was a vegetarian diet. And so many Adventists have also become vegetarian. The payoff is 14 years longer. The average vegetarian Adventist lives 14 years longer than the general population. That's significant, folks. There's something to these laws that God gave us. And all we're trying to do as Adventists is we're trying to live by them and do what we believe we should be doing. There was something else on that last slide. Some Adventists have taken the next step beyond vegetarianism and become vegan, which means no animal products whatsoever. Some of you might have heard that Bill Clinton is actually right there right now. Bill Clinton has become a plant-based diet, is using now a plant-based diet, has totally become vegan, and he says that has saved his life. You remember Bill Clinton, they used to go to McDonald's when he's out jogging, get a hamburger while he's jogging, I always thought that was funny. You're trying to use calories and then you're eating hamburgers. Didn't make sense. Bill Clinton says veganism has saved his life. There's something about these principles of diet that God put in the Bible. There's something about them that can be a benefit to us. Daniel 1 verse 8. Daniel understood this. It says, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Understand that what we eat and drink can defile our bodies in God's way of looking at things. That's why it's so important to pay attention to what he wants us to do. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 31, Paul says this for God. He says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. Now I understand I've put a lot on you tonight. But if you say to yourself, I'm not doing most of that stuff, what could I do? This is on your outline, so you can take this home. There's this wonderful little acronym called New Start. How could you get a new start? If you're having problems in your life with some of these diseases of the Egyptians, how could you have a new start? Here it is. Nutrition, exercise, water, sunlight, temperance, air, rest, trust in divine power. You know, if we put these principles in effect in our life, these are biblical principles of health. If we put these in effect in our lives, we can have a new start. I challenge you with that idea. The question is this, and I'll leave this up to you. Would you rather look like that or like that? The choice is up to you. Let's just close this part with prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for the fact that you love us so much that you gave us these principles in Scripture to help us avoid the diseases of the Egyptians. They're diseases that are so common today. So Lord, I pray that you would help us to make a new start. Put these principles that you put in Scripture into practice in our lives so that we can serve you in the very best way possible. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.